Good morning and good afternoon, and welcome to ASQ Lean Enterprise Division webinar series. Today we present The Silent Enemy of Continuous Improvement by Jim Lancaster. He's the CEO of Lantec. The one thing I can tell you about Jim is he's tall, dark, and handsome, but I'm going to leave it to him to tell you the rest about what he has to offer you today. Jim, it is all yours.
Thanks, Tricia. As you can tell, Tricia's never met me. I am here to talk a little bit about a problem that I have that I'm guessing you all listening have had as well. Have any of you ever put in an improvement project, worked your butt off, sweated, making a change in a process, only to come back 6 months later or a year later and find that all that hard work went for naught, that the improvements you put in place were gone? It's frustrating when that happens. And more importantly, it's a strategic tragedy for the organization that you work for. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the journey I've been on the last really 15 or 20 years and the learnings I've had with regard to that problem and how by solving that problem I've made dramatic improvements in the performance of Lantec, the organization that I run. But first what I want to do is to give you a little bit of background on Lantec so you understand the context from which I'm speaking. We design and build machines, equipment that wrap pallets. We have two separate manufacturing facilities with totally separate manufacturing, engineering, supply chains, etc. They're all sold through the same distribution and sales force. We have one culture, one business philosophy, about 525 or so folks working for us, about 140 million in gross turnover. The products are manufactured on production lines by sort of product family, if you will. There's 6 production lines in our Louisville manufacturing facility, and there's 4 production lines in our facility that's in the Netherlands, just across the German border. Let me talk a little bit about sort of the specifics of today. We have 4 pillars or strategic pillars that we really focus on and we build our whole business strategy around. And one of those is our lean objective. And specifically inside our lean objective, there's 2 components that this goes under. The first is that our objective is to accumulate process improvement. So making process improvement is interesting, but unless it can accumulate, it doesn't turn into a strategic advantage for our company. The second is the ability to accumulate our teams hunting like a pack. And you say, Jim, what do you mean by hunting like a pack? Well, hunt like a pack is our metaphor for how a 50-pound wolf gets to eat buffalo that weighs 25 times as much as they do for dinner. That wolf's able to do that because it works tightly together with its pack to overrun its prey. As humans, we can continually improve our pack skills and thereby overrun ever larger objectives. And it turns out that's a key to overrunning the barriers to holding on to improvements. And I'll get back and talk about that a little bit more in a second. But here is the outline, if you will, of what I'm about to talk about. The first thing I'm going to spend a little time on is what I call our 45-year history of desperately chasing the next big idea to stay ahead of our competitors. This probably doesn't happen in your all's companies, but whenever we start struggling, we're always looking for some big, huge change that's going to make all the difference in the world and save us and launch us ahead of our competitors. It's what I call the tyranny of chasing the next big thing. Second thing I'm going to talk about is how, and this is important, how the perfectly predictable deterioration of any and all process is actually the silent enemy that steals the return on improvements, and how that leads to the search for the next big thing and loops back to number 1. Third, how leaders that understand the work and natural deterioration become the believers in supporting work, and in order to stop the deterioration, sustain improvements. And lastly, I'm going to describe a very high-level overview of our lean management system, which provides the standard daily routine or standard work, if you will, for me and our whole leadership team cascaded down that combats that deterioration and allows for the accumulating of competitive advantage. So here we go. Lantec started like many companies, especially in America. It started with an idea. And It was my father Pat's invention of rotary stretch wrapping, followed literally by hundreds of technology breakthroughs, resulting in stretch wrapping really becoming the standard for how products are shipped in the world. And so that invention launched us. And between 1972 and 1989, we continued to innovate to make that more reliable, to spread it for more applications, make automatics and all kinds of different variants. Most of the time, we shipped the machines that our customers ordered from us within, let's just say, a month or so when we promised. We always got the machines working, but many times we didn't get them working until after we visited the customer a couple of 3 or 4 times after it was delivered. We had a maniacal sort of loyalty to our customers and making sure we took care of them, but it took a lot of work to take care of them and get our machines to perform the way they should. So my father Pat discovered in the late 80s that product performance difference was not enough to sustain the growth and success of the companies. We had competitors entering the market, and they caught up over time. We lost a key patent case. It was a real travesty of justice, actually, but we lost this key patent case, and the sudden loss of that really brought this to home. And it was only natural that technology and customer care that we'd grown up with was not enough to really sustain our 50 to 60% market share that we had at the time and still make a healthy profit. So we had to learn how to execute well, how to deliver quality, and how to be predictable with our customers. And Pat, my father, discovered the next big thing. So the first was the invention of stretch wrappers. I would say the next big thing is this idea of the Toyota production system, one-piece flow versus batch, TAC, JIT, Kanban, waste elimination, Kaizen, which was the sort of blitz process we used to implement it. And just as we did with the invention of stretch wrapping, he and the whole leadership team really threw their full energy in the execution of this big idea, and it was really a revolution. And it had a massive impact on our business. It was obviously written about in various books and Harvard Business Review and a bunch of places. But this operating process for us was so much better than what we were doing before. It produced an enormous lift. Our quality skyrocketed up, our productivity jumped, our flexibility rose, our on-time deliveries became the norm. We freed up a tremendous amount of resources. At the time, I think we were about 250 people. We freed up 60 people. We did not do any layoffs, so those 60 people then were able to work in product development, sales and marketing. We freed up a bunch of cash. The combination of the people and the cash turned into new products and new markets, and we doubled the size of the business very, very rapidly. My dad had successfully identified and executed the next big idea, and that story became that chapter in lean thinking and was told by many publications. Well, long about 1995, I took over as CEO, and I noticed something. We continued with the number of Kaizen events, and even though our sort of financial performance was still going well, I could tell we weren't having the same impact. We had to figure out how to get the progress going again, or our revenue growth and profit growth was really going to level out. You can see on this chart here, I got the blue dotted line there, which is what I was trying to do, which is continue the growth. I took over CEO at the height of this fervor over lean thinking. My dad was giving speeches on lean and working on new products, and I was trying to figure out why, if we're so cool and everybody wants to come take a tour, why was our growth slowing down, and why was our profit really just average for our industry? I remember really vividly standing at a few Kaizen event report outs in a row back in 2001, and they literally felt almost like carbon copies of prior Kaizen areas. I remember thinking to myself, standing there going, oh man, we've just taken 12 people for a week, worked them for 10 or 15 hours a day to make the same changes and solve the same problems we made in Kaizen workshops a few years ago. And I was just standing there fuming, getting frustrated. I remember thinking to myself, these big Kaizen changes, we've already made them all. The low-hanging fruit is gone. So now what do we do? Well, obviously I had to come up with the next big idea. And that's what I did. So the next big idea was, I know what I'll do. I'll make some acquisitions. we'll take all this lean knowledge and our innovative culture around customer needs, and I'll go buy some other businesses and product lines, and we'll spread it. So we made 2 of those in related industry, thinking we can convert them to lean and get the same lift we got in Louisville. We invested in global expansion. We bought out a distributor in Australia. We opened a sales and service office in China and Singapore, hired salespeople in Central and South America. We expanded our product offering. Some we developed ourselves, some we acquired. The problem was that we didn't really get the growth. This is what actually happened, that red line. 5 years passed as I chased these big ideas. I was exhausted. We barely had moved the needle on financial performance. What's crazy is what we focused on really grew and improved. Those acquisitions we did, they were successfully converted to one-piece flow, and we had huge tangible results. Our global sales were going up, but the problem was that whatever we focused on, or didn't focus on, declined in performance and offset the gains of that hard work we were doing. I was working hard and making my life and the business more complicated, and I was getting more and more frustrated. My wife and my kids were not happy with me. I was traveling all the time, and the performance of the business, which was supposed to be the offset, just was not improving. So we went to work on trying to figure out what was going on. And this is what was going on. It's a simple concept. This bucket that you see on the screen sort of represents our competitive level or our improvement bucket, if you will. And we kept pouring in innovation and pouring in process improvement and pouring in new products, thinking that that level in the bucket was all those different things were going to accumulate, and that bucket was going to fill up, and that would allow us to be more competitive and either convert that into profitability or revenue growth. But that now more complex product line and that diverse customer base we fought so hard to get was now resulting in quality issues and cost overruns and delivery deterioration. And what that causes is we were spending most of our time just managing the crisis of the day, running around trying to put out fires. I'm sure none of you guys have that problem. Why couldn't we accumulate new products, great new products, plus this lean one-piece flow Toyota production system advantage, plus new product solutions, plus a global presence, and really dominate? I couldn't understand why we couldn't just add and it would continue to accumulate. It just didn't. Well, I had some friends in a business group I'm a part of, and they said, Jim, your problem is you've got this very nice family-style culture, and you don't hold your managers accountable to keep what's been done, and because you don't have that strong accountability culture, that's what's causing things to deteriorate. So I tried another big idea. I ramped up leadership accountability significantly. I did it primarily through hiring some professional managers and leaders from large companies. You know, negotiate targets with managers and then hold them accountable for those results. Let them figure out how to get it done. Make sure there's consequences for failing and benefits for hitting their commitments. Sound like that makes sense. But again, this big idea didn't move the needle at all. It did chase some good people away, and now it was nearing the end of 2006. And just to be clear, I'm not saying accountability is a bad thing. Nothing could be further from the truth. In retrospect, the problem was that accountability focus didn't work because, like many companies, maybe some of yours, many of our managers didn't believe that they had any real control or influence on how the people they were responsible for did their work. Many of them didn't even understand how the work got done by the people who worked for them. So under pressure, instead of using their time to support their people and help them, these managers focused on other ways of generating value, ones they could claim as their value to the business. Therefore, the manager's only regular involvement with the people they were meant to be managing was to, tell them what had to get done and report on what happened. All these things the manager was telling his team to do, along with his own ideas, normally just turned into disruptions to his reports' ability to actually get work done. The opposite of what management role was really created to do. Manager's real role is to support the people that work for them so they can be successful in their job. So anyway, after I tried that for a while and it didn't work, next big idea, I need some help. And I got lucky. I found a gentleman, his name's Bob Morgan. right at the height of my frustration. And Bob had successfully implemented enormous cultural change and process change at TRW in Europe, and then had spent a number of years at Delphi where he had made huge conversions in one of their divisions. And I agreed to his non-negotiable terms so he'd help me out. And by now I'd been working hard for 11 years as a CEO. While the business had grown, I knew there had to be a better way. By the way, those demands that Bob made were that I would clear my diary for this effort, that I'd go to the manufacturing floor to learn again, and then we would read and discuss this book called The Art of War, which I'm sure many of you guys have read. And that's exactly what we did. I spent the next 7 months literally from 6 in the morning to 4 in the afternoon on the shop floor, and then I did what was left of my CEO duties after 4. I spent the next 7 months learning how to see work, design work, solve problems with the work, create pull loops, create visuals, and teach others how to do the same. All at his direction, or really, it's actually more his demand. And during that time, I saw exactly how difficult it was to get fast support to everyday issues that come up in the work. And I'm going to explain a little bit more of that. So this is a picture of an electrical panel that goes to one of our simpler machines that we make in a production cell where the components are put in the control box and all the wiring is done and labeling done, etc. This is where I learned, after what seemed like an eternity, what work is and how to see it. Now, it sounds like a silly thing to say, but I didn't really understand what work, how to describe work. And I remember standing there for a long time. I just saw the parts. There's 25 or 30 parts in the control box, most of which could be different between machine variants. Our machines have a tremendous number of options and are all different coming down the production line. There's roughly 100 wires of different lengths, different gauges, different colors with different labels on them. I started by trying to just make Jennifer was the operator at the time, make her job better, get the panel to a height where she was not straining to reach the top of it, develop some work aids from the schematics to make it easy to see what went where, and I put the steps in a sequence based on what the operator had learned from that was easiest. I moved material around so it was easy to reach, and I got rid of all the unnecessary tools, replaced worn-out tools in the area, etc. Then I started to document the work. This was a 3-hour tack time, meaning it took 3 hours for the person to do the work in this area. And I had 3 hours of work to document. Yikes. Okay, select the motor controller, install it with 4 1/4-20 flathead screws. Measure out 25 inches of 12-gauge red wire. Strip the left side, strip the right side, label it with an A to B label. And I did this for what seemed like an eternity. It was probably about 2 days or so. And finally, Bob Morgan walks over, and he's standing behind me in the cell, and he puts his hands on my head, right where my ears are, and kind of pushes my head kind of down right where Jennifer's hands are. And he got it through my head that the work is not the components. He said, Jim, you're documenting the components. You need to document what Jennifer's hands are doing, where her eyes are going, and what she's having to think about and what decisions she's having to make. So finally I got it through my head that the operator was doing the same thing over and over again most of the cycle, meaning wiring. It's a 3-hour tack time, but really she's doing the same thing over and over again. So I quit looking at the parts and started looking at her hands and her eyes and her feet. Find the instruction, interpret the instruction, select the wire, measure the wire, cut the wire, strip the left side, strip the right side, label left side, label right side, terminate the left side, terminate the right side. It did not matter how long the wire was, what color the wire was, or specifically where the wires were terminated. The work was the same. Finally, I started to see work as opposed to the product or the part. And while this sounds simple, and many of you probably know this, I can't tell you what a breakthrough this is in an environment where there's so much variation, where that variation can be used as a block to improvement. This idea of the difference between the work and the part is especially important when you start looking at processes in the office where the variation gets enormous and people believe you can't create standardization of work steps because of that variation. So after I started working on that, this is a picture of some wire labels. You peel those wire labels off and you wrap them around the wires. And the weeks I spent watching, documenting, trying to improve the cell also allowed me to see that every once in a while the operator didn't have the wire labels available when she started. So I watched, and she called the team leader over, who would go retrieve a generic set from the bottom drawer of her desk that only worked on some of the wires, while waiting on engineering to respond to an email request to get the labels down to the floor. I also noticed the labels weren't on the sheet in the order that was easiest for the operator. So I had a brilliant idea. My brilliant idea was to get the wire labels on the sheet in the order that the wires were put in the panel, so the operator would not have to search for the correct labels. So I remember tapping Jennifer on the shoulder. I said, Jennifer, I got this great idea. What if I can get these labels put in the order in which you're actually wiring? She kind of looks over her shoulder with that look that my teenage daughters give me, which is, hey, dummy, don't you think I already thought of that? And she and the team leader explained that my great idea had already been tried and implemented a few years ago as part of one of these Kaizens, but the components had changed, so the label order is no longer correct. The team leader said she had requested engineering to update the order of the labels, but engineering has had it on their list for months. So I got kind of frustrated, pulled my cell phone out of my pocket and called the engineering team leader, and he was standing in the panel area in 10 minutes. And that's where we showed him the issue. And, oh, he says, oh, Jim, Jennifer, that really would make a difference. Let me go see what I can do. Guess what? The next morning, he's brought us a fresh set of labels in the correct order. So after he was done and Jennifer got a smile on her face, I asked him, you know, what's the scoop? Why had that not happened earlier? And he looked at me kind of sheepishly, and he looked down at his shoes. And he said, you know, someone had requested the change in the order of these labels via email some time ago, but he didn't know why, and his priority was really the improvement objectives he had with his leader. And he had agreed on those objectives with his boss, and they had nothing to do with wire labels. They were about CAD operator utilization, and he really was behind on that already and didn't really have time for projects from a different area. And I'm thinking, does it really take the CEO to get the operator support? Well, when it crosses department lines, it is tough to get stuff done, especially small stuff that's not being pushed by somebody way up the food chain. All those improvements that get support cross-functionally in our organization back then were done based on relationships. So, why is such a simple issue not fast to remedy? So, top level, what I learned in the panel cell, in addition to standardized work, was seeing and understanding the work is harder than it looks. You can't see and understand work from a distance. You can't see and understand work from just a gimbal walk, as they call it, or from the aisle. And the second is, does it really take the CEO to get rapid support to the operator? That operator needs cross-functional support right when they need it, and we weren't able to give that support as an organization. So after I'd spent, I don't know, it's probably a month or so in that cell, getting it stable and learning, Bob thought it was time for me to teach. So the next area that needed the most work in the plant was our paint line. So I spent a number of weeks on our paint line running and teaching standardized workshops. Let me explain a little bit about our paint line. It's an overhead conveyor that transports parts and carts through a wash booth and then a dry-off area and then a manual powder paint booth before it passes through an oven on its way back to be unloaded. There's 5 operators on the line, plus a team leader. That's 2 loaders, actually loaders and unloaders, 1 person in the washdown booth, 1 in dry and plug where they plug holes so they don't get paint in them, and 1 painter. And I did a series of standardized workshops with a team of folks to work on sort of their beliefs and knowledge about lean with these students and hopefully improve the huge bottleneck of our paint line. And it was a real challenge to get this process performing dramatically different and get the work process standardized. The most difficult thing and what I was really proud of was how we used a sequencer and a pseudo pull signal from the production lines to paint an order of what was needed next versus paint what showed up to be painted. And I know that sounds simple, but it was really complex because we had 6 production lines all providing parts and all demanding painted parts from a central paint line, and figuring out how to run them through the paint line and not run any factories out of painted parts was quite a challenge. So after a lot of iteration and great support, we had an enormously improved line and some new lean zealots starting to sprout. And I was feeling kind of cocky, to be honest. I thought I'd done a great job. I had these people pumped up, and the paint line was singing along, and all our production downtime on the production lines for lack of painted parts had gone down, and our quality issues had dropped. I mean, I was feeling good. Well, I had to leave for a couple of weeks to go to our European operation and meet with some customers. And when I got back, I went to see how my prized paint line was doing. And my factory's has got a long central aisle, and I'm walking down this long central aisle, and I can see it's about almost a quarter of a mile of the back of the plant, and I could see as I started walking down the main line, I could see paint carts in the aisle. I knew there was a problem. When I got back there, I was just absolutely horrified. The physical changes of what we had put in place were still there, but the sequencer and the pull process was gone. The standard work that ensured all the correct holes were plugged on each individual plate before it was painted was gone. And I was ticked off. I was really fit to be tied. So first thing I did is I grabbed the team leader, and we got the paint line back up and running with the process, got everything back kind of moving in the right direction. It took probably 3 or 4 hours just to get it all back sorted out and running the right way. And I turned to Rob, who's the team leader, still is, of the paint line, and I said, Rob, what happened? What happened? He said, Jim, it turned out not long after you left, the paint line was hit with this huge retrofit order. All these fabrications came in from the retrofit group, and we hadn't planned for those. They weren't in our sequencer, and it messed up the entire process we put in place. And they worked in these special parts, and then once they worked in the special parts, they got behind, so then they just started painting what they thought was needed next, which then quickly sort of morphed into painting whatever showed up next. The other standards in the other areas sort of fell away for various other reasons. In one case, the operator that was in the sort of dry off and plug area was promoted off the line while I was gone, and the new operator was not trained on the new standard work because the team leader was trying to keep the line, get the line caught back up from that problem I just talked about. And while your factories probably never have problems like this, it's just amazing what the real world looks like from a team leader's eyes on a daily basis. And that's really what I learned here, which is that there's a huge number of variables that attack the process every single day. I call it a sandcastle. Every process in every area is like a sandcastle, and the wind and the waves and 2-year-olds are there to destroy that sandcastle. And if somebody's not there to shore it up on an ongoing basis, the sandcastle just washes away. And the other interesting thing is those operators and team leaders, they can't control a lot of the variables on the sandcastle. And they can't maintain it all by themselves because a lot of the change comes from outside areas that they don't have control of. So anyway, a couple of weeks later, Bob Morgan was in for his couple of days a month in our annual strategic planning process, and I told him what had happened and said, what, do I really have to be the paint team leader for life? All this work I'm doing, I've spent months down here on the floor now, it's not adding up to anything if I have to be the paint leader for life. And it was funny, he smiled and he said, okay, you're ready for the next step. And that night we went out for dinner like we always do when he's in town, and he explained and diagrammed out the management system structure that we needed to put in place. And I came in, I'm taking notes feverishly on a napkin while I'm having a glass of wine. The next morning I came in and I wrote it all out on my grease board in my office. And luckily I took a picture of it, and that's what's on the slide here. And that board, those points that are right there on the board, became our management structure and system that got put in place now right at 10 years ago, and is still going on every single morning and has every morning since that day. So what the grease board says in a sense is we had this problem, remember, we were not accumulating competitive advantage. So we needed a strong management system that holds gains through management's quick response. And it allows for and facilitates improvement over time with the time freed up for firefighting. So this is important. If we can hold the gains, then we're not firefighting all the time, and it actually frees up time for improvement. And we get the benefit of holding the gains and the accumulation of the gains, and we also get the benefit of more time working on improvement. And so it's a beautiful thing if we can get it going. So where does all this freed up time come from? My behavior would have told you 5, 6 years, or I guess now it's 10, 15 years ago, it would indicate that I believe when you put a process in place and then you put the manager in place to manage that process, like I put this new process in place in the paint line, then the assumption would be that that manager would continue to improve what we'd started from. But the reality is when you put a process in place, here's actually what happens. The tool gets, a process deteriorates. A tool gets dull, so there's a workaround. Engineering changes a part, and the fixture stops fitting just right. So you have to hold the part kind of to one side of the fixture or something to get it lined up. A new operator is put in place and doesn't understand the performance requirements and changes the work slightly. The good news is, which is interesting, if you leave a little bit of time, that problem's going to get really big. And once that problem gets really big, then it gets prioritized and somebody decides they want to fix it. And there's a team put in place and a plan and deliverables and all this improvement work, which just goes back around the horn and fixes something that was already fixed at one point. And so what if we actually fixed the problem back on the left side of the screen? What if we actually fixed the problem right when we first saw any indication of deterioration? We fixed it right when it was really, really small. Then big issues requiring a project to get them back on track, guess what? They would go away. The whole idea of quality teams prioritizing big issues and improving them, a lot of that would go away because we wouldn't accumulate these big problems. So great, Jim, that sounds good. How do I do that? Well, it starts with this idea of the golden triangle. And the golden triangle is a management system that's set up and assumes that it needs to efficiently handle support issues fast. So instead of assuming that a process that's in place is going to work every day, this process assumes that there's going to be problems every single day. So most management systems are set up assuming problems won't happen. And if they do happen, they can be handled by the functional leadership in the area. But ideally, this management system I'm talking about starts with well-designed, standardized work there at the top. Although much of the work that happens at Atlantic is still far from well-designed, standardized work, this process still works. But the more standardized the work is, the better it works. Then there needs to be a way for a visual to be triggered when that work comes out of standard. Typically, that gets triggered, at least in our plant, by time variation. So if it takes longer to do a job, probably that's because something's changed. The tool's gotten dull, somebody's not trained, some problem, or there's a defect in a piece of whip. The visual can come from an operator, throwing an andon light. When we started this process, we just picked easy-to-measure quality metrics in every functional area of the entire company. And that was all we needed to see variation in day-to-day performance and start solving problems. Because these visuals were viewed by the manager at specific times and the manager knew exactly what to do with the problems, then the reaction by the manager was standardized. And that's really what I talk about here at the bottom, moving to the left. And because it's standardized, it can be counted on by the operator. It might be to step in and help keep the operator on time and then help figure out what has changed. If they can take care of the issue with a fresh tool or maybe a bit of training or maybe a request of support from a separate department like our tool and die group, then the issue is closed. But in reality, many problems can't be solved the correct way that close to the work. So, for example, if there's a problem with the tool and it needs the tool and die area to repair a fixture, and that request is put in place, but it's not prioritized by the tool and die guys, then it may be a week or two before the solution's put in place, which is a real problem. So, in order to provide that fast response, a structured walkabout review, what we call the WAR, or walkabout review, that cascades from all functions daily, starting at 6 a.m., allows for a specific time every day to provide support to frontline managers and connects the standardized work of every operation, every operator, all the way to the top of the organization and across the functional areas every single morning. The review is in the area of work, so as to least disrupt the people closest to value add. So these aren't happening in meeting rooms. These are happening in the areas of work. So at the top of the page there, you see between 6 and 6:15, team leaders are meeting with operators, checking metrics from the prior day, making sure the area is set up for success for the day, that we have all our operators, and that they're in a cell that they're trained for. At 6:15, between 6:15 and 7, the factory leader, which is the person we call that runs a whole production line, goes to each one of his team leaders and reviews their boards and says, are you green for the day? Were you green on your metrics yesterday? If you weren't, are there issues you need support on? What are your processes you're going to use today to get back green? And if they need support, they give them support. And that just rolls up. So, for example, then at 7 to 8, the manufacturing head tours every one of the factories and spends a few minutes with them making sure they're green for the day and all their team leaders are green for the day and if they need anything. So in the case of this tool and die situation where it wasn't prioritized to take care of that problem that a specific operator had, that manufacturing manager goes to the tool and die at the end of his walk as standard so he can change the prioritization in that area if he thinks that makes business sense. So things get responded to and they escalate up to the person responsible very rapidly during the morning. And then it finishes, the senior leadership team walks every functional area in the company in the morning, and we visit the manufacturing area between we visit all the manufacturing between 9:40 and 9:50, just 10 minutes for the actual manufacturing manager, if that makes sense. Oops, I'm not hitting the buttons, I'm talking. This is a model for what the board looks like in each area. At the top are the metrics. We now have lots of metrics we track. We track quality metrics, cost metrics, safety metrics, and delivery metrics. But when we started, we only put quality metrics in place because that was our biggest business issue. And we didn't need to track a whole bunch of metrics if we didn't have the capacity to make improvements in those areas. So just under that is a corrective action section with what's the issue, what's going to be done, who's in charge, and by when. And any quality problem we have has to have a solution for that individual part or that individual customer so we don't ship a defect. So they go on there. But the next section below that is what's kind of interesting. It's what we call the quality loop board. There's only room for 5 issues there. And if there's an opening there, and there's not 5 issues, then we take one of the corrective actions for today that made us red on one of those andons, and then we go back to root cause. We go observe the area and try to find out what actually caused the issue and try to eliminate the problem at the root. We only have 5 slots because once you go over 5, you start spending your time from an improvement perspective managing data and prioritizing as opposed to solving. So we don't collect large numbers of quality issues and then prioritize and decide what to do. We decide what to improve based on the problems we're having right now today, because the efficiency and productivity of making the improvements that way goes up so much, it more than pays for the problem of not necessarily working on the most important one today. I can't tell you how much impact that has on our ability to improve rapidly, because a live crime scene makes it so much easier to solve a problem. On the right-hand side of the board is how we improve. I'm not going to spend much time there because it took us a couple of years before we got the left-hand side stable enough that we even did the improvement side. But the improvement side is made up of A3s with specific initiatives. They either come down from me or they're functional area improvements. Then they're broken down into key task monitors at different levels, which are basically project management tools that lay out the steps to accomplish what we want to accomplish in the A3 with time slots, so that we can do the red-green thing of being on track with improvement projects just like we do with daily metrics, and we can provide the cross-functional support to the success of these KTMs and A3s in the same way we do daily management. So that's what the boards look like in sort of outline form, and they're everywhere. Every functional area, I don't care whether you're in purchasing or finance or IT or materials or in our fab shop or an assembly area, the boards are structured basically the same way. This is a diagram, basically, it's changed a bit now because we've expanded our factory in Louisville, and the red line there sort of takes you on the walk that I do in the mornings, and it starts at the end with shipping, and it moves back up the value process. And the reason we start at the end at shipping is they're the closest to the customer, and if you have a problem in shipping, it's probably going to have its cause further up the system. And if I have a problem in manufacturing, which is the next place I go, it's probably up the system in materials or engineering or in a bad order definition or something like that. So we walk backwards through the system, shipping and manufacturing and materials, receiving and service and engineering and procurement or materials, inside sales. Now we hit marketing, outside sales, and then we hit HR. And then we hit the overhead areas, if you will, on Fridays, which are IT, product development, accounting, and finance. So that's sort of how the process works literally on a daily basis. But management, just to be clear, management is what happens standing there at the board. Only deviations are discussed. Items that are green don't need to be mentioned when we can see they're already green. Our job as managers is not to stand at the boards in judgment. We have different jobs depending on who we are standing at the board. When a manager has a problem this morning or a metric that's deviated from the mean or from what's green or red, if you will, yesterday, she will explain what she knows or has observed so far and have the problem and her next step written there on the board with when she's going to report back on that step, if it's in her area. Typically, the next step almost always the next step will be reported out on the next day at the latest, if not in some special process if it's critical. So there's cross-functional managers standing there at the board, and what they're thinking is, does this issue involve my area? Do I need to participate in the next step or take this issue back to my board because it started in my area? And then there's me or my general manager that's a cross-functional manager, and what I'm doing is I'm first evaluating, is that problem being handled in the correct place? And if so, I'm just looking to see if the next step is standard for problem solving. And if we have an immediate countermeasure to run well today, and so that we don't impact customers. And if that's the case, I don't say a word, I just say silent. If we jumped past the observation stage, which is normally what happens, where somebody will go, I know what the problem is, and they've got a solution written up there, and they've never gone and actually looked at where the problem was and make sure we got the problem right, then what I'll do is I'll ask the manager what they observed themselves. And now, having done it this long, I don't have to say much, and they go, oh, I need to go look. Early on, that was a lot of coaching. They tend to then change their next action to go see and investigate step. If the problem's coming from a different area and the manager is with us that day on the walk, he's handed the pen and asked what his next step is and when he can report back. And he writes it up on the board with when he's going to report back with his initials. If that manager for that cross-functional area is not standing there, or the cross-functional manager, then what's going to happen is the cross-functional manager, whether it's me or the general manager, will put the action item up themselves with their name on it, or I'll put my name on it and my report back date. It's my responsibility until I can get it handed to the correct functional area. And then I take a note, currently it's on my iPad or on a notepad, for delivering that issue later in the walk to the correct functional area. So the idea is we get the right person in charge of dealing with the right issues very, very rapidly and as close as we can to the work. So this results in cross-functional support every single morning. And priorities are adjusted daily cross-functionally. And it really creates this clarity of responsibility of who decides what. And what I want to reinforce here is putting the boards up doesn't do anything. You got to have this management thing I'm talking about happening at the boards with the right people at the boards for the magic to really start happening. I can't overemphasize enough the results this had on our business. We solve cross-functional support issues on the fly every day by the tens. Literally, tens if not hundreds a day. We resolve cross-functional work priorities every day. And this fast expectation for supports caused us to become crystal clear on who's responsible for what and created numerous principles for how to make quick decisions right there at the board. We have a decision-making tool now that if somebody needs a decision, for example, buying something capital or making a pricing decision or a decision on something with regard to a customer, we have an outline for exactly how they prepare so they can get that decision made in the 10-minute meeting that's happening in their area. So, for example, if resolution can be handled within your span of control as a manager, it's your responsibility to resolve unless it impedes a previous commitment to something cross-functional, in which case the manager who has responsibility for the intersection of those two areas makes the call. Hopefully that makes sense. Obviously, we encourage involvement, but responsibility is clear. In the old days, I used to encourage the functional leaders that were to sort of figure it out between themselves, go talk to each other and sort of negotiate out how they were going to solve problems. But that was not that really set these functional managers up to fight it out between themselves, between how they're measured individually for their success. And then what would happen is they would just compromise. The problem is a compromise is not always the best solution for the customer or for the business. It's just a way to split the baby between the two functional areas, which is not the way to make decisions. So the impact from this is improvements accumulate. In short, we started making daily company-wide trade-off decisions instead of just as a functional groups. We became able to change what we're doing cross-functionally daily. We were hunting like a pack, like I talked about at the beginning, as a total organization, not just as one functional area. I've not talked here about how we implemented this, but the short answer was we implemented it across the entire company all at once, literally within 10 days. But we narrowed the focus by only focusing on quality, and the results were astounding, with quality defect measures and things like call drop rates and on-time shipments improving by orders of magnitude in a very short time frame. We went from 10% dropped calls in our call centers to less than 0.5% of dropped calls in our call centers in a matter of 90 days. But the big test was when the economic debacle happened in 2008. We added cost measures to the quality measures I've been talking about, and we used this cross-functional process to improve variable margin by 7 percentage points. I'm not talking about 7% total, I'm talking about percentage points. That was a 25% improvement in gross margin. And we also dropped expenses dramatically. That money, with that extra money, we could maintain more of our workforce. We were literally making hundreds of decisions and providing the cross-functional support cross-functionally to execute insourcing rapidly, to maintain as many jobs as possible, and stay viable with an instantaneous 60% drop in order rate. Our revenue on machines went down by 60% in 2008. And using this process, we were able to switch gears very, very rapidly and dramatically change our competitiveness so that our profitability maintained, and then when we came out of it, it exploded. So why does all this work? How do these improvement results just keep getting better just by maintaining? It's kind of a math exercise, actually. If you look here, I have a chart where you'll have any variation in a metric, in a quality metric, for example. So we take an average of the last 90 days of the metric, and we just draw a line through the center, and we say that's our metric. So any time, any day that our performance is lower than that metric, then the line goes red. You see the X's there, and we try to fix what we thought, what the problems of that day that were unusual. They're not necessarily the most important. They're the unusual ones and the ones that we can fix rapidly. Well, when you do that, you start making lots of improvements. Pretty soon, 30 days later, you redo a 90-day average, and the line just moved up. That causes new sets of problems to be flagged. You solve those problems. Another 30 days or 90 days goes by. You re-average the line. What's expected on a daily basis moves up. You make improvements underneath that. You'll see we didn't set a target. We didn't say how good do we want our drop call rate. What we said was what is our drop call rate, and if we did it that well on average over the last 90 days, we ought to be able to do it every day that well. And if we didn't do it that well yesterday, what was different about yesterday, and then solve those problems. And the magnitude of improvement was incredible. So my point here is it's all about the work. We have to learn to see work, we have to learn how to design work, and we have to learn how to manage work. This big idea actually makes the big ideas get rolling. The acquisition I told you about we made in Europe back in 2001, it went 5 years after we purchased it. It was growing, but it really wasn't making any money. It started very small, $3 million in revenue, earned a minuscule profit. We grew it to $5 million in revenue, but no profit by 2007. We put in one-piece flow, Kaizen, all that during those 5 years. But when we put in the management system and created some believers, the results started to change. That business is now over 35 million euro in turnover a year, 6 million in pre-tax profit, and that converts to 20% EBITDA on net revenue. And that, for those of you, I don't know how many of you on the phone call here are in the equipment business, but that's great results for a business in our industry. So that's roughly 4 times the average. Our warranty cost has dropped, our very margin has improved, and people have more fun because they're not as frustrated because they can get their problem solved. So my challenge to you, if lean improvements are not impacting your income statement and you have little time for improvement, maybe you don't have an improvement problem. Maybe you have a deterioration problem. And what you do about an improvement problem is not the same thing as what you do about a deterioration problem. So I've got a bunch of next steps lined out here, but I want to leave a few minutes for questions, so I'm not going to go through them. They're in the book. I really encourage you to get the book. It's called The Work of Management, A Daily Path to Sustainable Improvement. It's an easy, quick read. I tell the story of my journey and a lot more of my learnings along the way, and also I'm much more specific about how we implemented this management system and how it operates on a day-to-day basis. So with that, Tricia, I'll turn it back over to you, and we can have a couple questions.
Thank you, Jim. That was an excellent presentation. A lot of information to cram into 1 hour. Just for the participants, the PowerPoint will be available to you, and this will also be posted on YouTube within a week of this presentation. So we'll move to the first question, and I think you've probably heard this before, and maybe from your level you can help answer it, is when you have a manager who keeps tribal knowledge, won't let it go, and as soon as you walk off the floor, they try to revert those processes back, what's the best way to help that person let go of the information and ensure that your process improvement continues?
Well, I think that, let's see, how do I answer that the best way? First of all, I don't let that happen. So you know, I'm pretty demonstrative, especially the older I get and the more experience I've got, I'm pretty demonstrative with the fact that our quality systems and metrics have to be on the board. And if not, I'll stand there with the whole group of managers, and it creates an accountability that those things happen. So by demanding to go see, it makes a big difference. The other tool I used a lot in the beginning is I would go to the place of work with the manager and help them find the problem. And I'd stand there with them. And, you know, it's generally not long before they start seeing the same thing I'm seeing, and they start having fun with it because they can actually, you know, solve problems. The other thing is soon as managers start seeing they're not going to get skewered and blamed for problems, they start opening up. In a lot of cases, people are doing that sort of hold it all in thing because they're worried about being blamed because there's a culture in the organization of when there's a problem, it's clearly somebody's fault. And it took us a couple of years to get that out of our language standing there at the board. I mean, when you're standing there and something's red, it cannot be who did it. It's got to be who's gone and watched to see what's wrong. Because I'm telling you, 90% of the time, not 100%, but 90% of the time, the reason something went bad is not because somebody intentionally screwed up. It's because we put in place undoable work for the person, or let's say work that's very difficult to do at a high-quality level. And once you go watch it, you're like, oh, no wonder. I mean, I would have screwed it up too, or I would have had a high probability of screwing it up if I was there. I don't know if that helps, but.
No, fantastic. And a couple of the people listening, I want to say at least a couple of dozen have said, wow, we have these same issues. We're struggling sustaining improvements already made. Really very relevant to today's issues, especially in the workplace when people are struggling to retain their positions. Do you have any comments for that of how do we help them with that struggle?
So, I mean, I said it in here, but let me say it again, and I cannot tell you how firmly I believe this. If you don't have a stable process, you can't improve it. And every day, there's no question as a manager, you can't stop doing the firefighting to, you know, ship whatever you have to ship today or get whatever the process is you're in charge of done today. But you have to have a parallel process. I call it paddling and bailing. You know, there's an argument between two guys in a paddle boat that has a hole in it that's a mile from shore and it's leaking. And they're arguing whether they should paddle or whether they should bail. And the point is the argument's irrelevant. You have to paddle or you're never going to get to shore, and you have to bail or you're going to sink. And in this case, you have to do some firefighting, and you have to get a process that starts to stabilize. And what I would submit to you is the way to get a process to start stabilizing is not to take on the biggest problems, the most prioritized problems, because they're big and hairy or they would have already been solved. Try to decide, pick a metric, a quality metric. It is my favorite, at least in my business. And if I was able to do it well yesterday, why today was I worse than yesterday, and fix that issue. Generally, the issues that vary between good and bad on a daily basis are the ones that are easier to fix. And over a relatively short period of time, solving those easier to solve problems will start to stabilize your process, will free up some of your time, and then you can take on some of the bigger issues. Then, if I was a middle manager in a company, guess what? Somebody's going to start noticing that your performance is moving up. So you can't just do it with heroics. You've got to do it with a system that can accumulate. And if you have a daily process that's watching what's going on and fixing stuff that deteriorates, that way when you add the next improvement, it actually accumulates. So a lot of companies don't really think about accumulation. They think about just improvement or the next big idea.
Excellent, excellent. One final question before we let you go. What type of training was given to the functional teams and managers as part of the 10-day rollout?
I showed the slide. Y'all are going to get the slide with my hand written up on the grease board. We went through that. That was the training.
Okay.
But I had a clipboard, and so did my VP of Ops. And on the clipboard was some notes to ourselves. Don't take over unless it's my responsibility. Did you support the people at the meeting, or did you take support away from them? We would ask ourselves as we left every stop, how do those people feel about that interaction we just had? And I don't mean that the interactions need to be soft and mushy and everything. What I mean is, did we actually help them or not? And the thing I tell people in my place all the time is, we make machines, and the people that are putting the machines together and shipping them, they make the money. The rest of us are blood-sucking overhead. And the only reason we are here is to facilitate those people that are actually putting the machines together's ability to do that on a daily basis. So if we go in and interrupt them, if we go in and make their job harder, we're not helping us make more money, we're not helping the customer out. So those stories, and we sort of did it as we went. We go back around, put our arms around people and go, look, I know this is a struggle. You don't want to put it up there that it's red because you're afraid you're going to be blamed. This is not a performance review. It's a good thing when we have a deviation from the standard because that gives us something we can go to work on. So I don't know if that's helping, but I think training is good, but the bottom line is you got to do this live and in color, so to speak, with a drive in your gut to make the interactions actually supportive and have the right people there to actually be able to solve problems. And it takes a while, and it's kind of ugly at the beginning, and you sometimes got to go back and apologize. And I found a few people through the process that just couldn't change their habits and could no longer be in management with us. But most of it was just breaking habits down. Some people, they'd break the habit down in a week, and some people it took, a year.
Excellent. Well, Jim Lancaster, CEO of Lantech, ASQ Lean Enterprise Division, thanks you for spending an hour with us and our members today. We want everyone to save the date of October 11, 2017 for our next presentation. We will be inviting Mr. Lancaster back in the future, so stay posted on LinkedIn or YouTube or Twitter as to the presentations. Again, this is Tricia Zulik with ASQ Lean Enterprise Division, and we thank you for your participation today. Take care.